Now, before you get too excited and get carried away applying lots of effects to your layers, I really want you to get to grips with the basic keyframing and animation principles in After Effects. And I think they're the foundation to a good knowledge in After Effects. If you know how to control keyframes in the timeline, you can do virtually anything you want with effects. But it's a really important foundation that shouldn't be missed. So we're going to start off by talking about where the terminology for keyframing comes from. And then we're going to have a look at how that's applied in After Effects. So if you want to follow along, open Transform Properties AEP, which you can find in the Animation Basics folder. So here we have some drawings that I've done of a dog for a traditional style of animation. Basically, the way traditional animation works, if you imagine that I'm working for Walt Disney would draw the key frames of the animation, so the most important frames. So that would maybe be the start frame here. And if I use the preview panel, I can jump to the last frame, which is that one. And he would say, okay, this is where I want the dog to end. This is where I want it to start. And he'd then hand those frames to me, and I'd be the assistant animator, also known as the tweener. And the reason I'd be called the tweener is because I'd be filling in all the steps in between. And if you see, if we move through one frame at a time, you can see here are the in-between frames, and hence the word tweening. So that's how traditional animation works. You have the key frames, the most important frames, the key frames, drawn by the lead animator, first and last, and then the tweener, or assistant animator, would fill in all the steps in between. Now, when you're in After Effects, you are the lead animator, so you're Walt Disney, you set the key frames of the animation. But After Effects is your tweener, it fills in all the steps in between. So let's have a look at how this looks, this series of drawings. And you see we get a nice fluid animation by putting a series of drawings together like that. But what I've done here is I've created an After Effects version of this as well. And if you want to follow along, you can open up Transform Properties AEP from the Animation Basics folder and open O2 Thug Dog Walk Cycle. Just double click it to open it up. And you'll see in here I have an After Effects version of the animation. Obviously, I've redrawn this and illustrated it properly using Adobe Illustrator. But basically, the way that this works, if we select something like the thigh, for example, I can open up the thigh, and you'll see in there I have basic transform properties. And what I've done is I've animated those by setting what are called keyframes. And these are keyframes that you can see down in the timeline. And I've animated all of these properties, anchor point, position, scale, rotation. Each of those have been animated to create this movement. So I basically say that's where I want the leg to start, that's where I want it to end, and After Effects works out all the steps in between for me. So this is quite a complicated animation, but if we have a look at this one here, O4 drink, 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 you can follow along and I'll show you how to create the basic animation that's used to create this kind of effect. So open up O4 drink, 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 and in there we have some basic layers, and we're going to practice keyframing with these layers. So I want you to start by selecting this file here, and if you're unsure what you're selecting, click on the solo button here in this column, and that will allow you to solo layers. And we're selecting this symbol here, it's like a plus symbol within square brackets. Once you've soloed that, unsolo it so you can see the background. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have this move on screen from the top. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is just make our timeline a bit smaller, gives a little bit more space. And if we just zoom out to 50%, we'll have a little bit more space around the composition in order to animate. Now you can hold down spacebar just to move the comp down to give you a little bit more space up here, because we're going to animate from the top. So we're now in Walt Disney mode. This is where we want the animation to end. And quite often in animation, you want to set your first keyframe where you want it to end. Now, intuitively, you would think you would start at the beginning, but that's not always the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, I want this to be in this position at 1 second. So we're going to move to the 1 second mark, and we can do that by clicking on the timecode here and typing in 1 and then the period key on the number pad. So 1 full stop or period, and then hit enter on the number pad to move to the 1 second mark. Now, of course, you could drag the time marker to that mark if you wanted to, but we're going to move it. Then we're going to open up our layer, And in our layer, you'll see the transform property group. I want you to open that. You may need to resize your timeline. If you do, that's fine. And in there, you'll see 5 basic properties: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. And these are the properties that I want you to practice on before you get into animating effect properties. So we want this position to be here at this point in time. So what we do to start animating is we click on this little stopwatch, and it's called the time vary stopwatch. Basically, by clicking on that, you're saying to After Effects, okay, from now on, I want you to record any changes I make at new points in time to this property. So you're like clicking on the stopwatch to start recording. So we click on the stopwatch, and as we do, a couple of things happen. You'll notice a keyframe appears. And this diamond-shaped icon here is a keyframe, and it's a linear keyframe. We'll see other keyframe types as we work through After Effects. So we've said where we want it to end. We're still in Walt Disney mode, so we're now going to go back to the beginning and say where we want it to start. And in order to do that, there's a couple of things we could do. We could physically pick it up and drag it. And you'll notice that as we do, there's a little path appears. Okay, so we could drag it over to here if we want it to appear from here. Now, the other way of doing that, if I just undo that by hitting Command-C or Control-C on PC, is just by scrubbing values down here in the timeline. And I have an X and Y value that I can scrub independently of each other to get really accurate control. And of course, I can use the arrow keys when I've selected those values to nudge them into the exact position I want them to be. So either use the values down here or just click and drag your layer to where you want it to start. Now, we've set the keyframes. Do we need to set the in-between moments? No, we don't, because After Effects will do that for us. And if we click on the RAM Preview button, you'll notice that After Effects has worked out all the steps in between for us. So we set the initial keyframes. After Effects creates all the in-between frames for us. It's as easy as that. We're going to have another practice with that. So we're going to close up that layer, and we're going to select the Aqua Drop Shadow layer, which is this logo here. And with this one, we're going to animate 2 properties. So we're going to open up the layer, and this time open up the Transform property group again. Now, there are keyboard shortcuts for selecting these properties if you don't want to keep opening them up. And they're really easy to remember. So you've got S will select scale, R will select rotation, P will select position, A will select anchor point, and the only one that's not really logical is T for opacity. But if you think opacity or transparency, then it's easy to remember. Also, the word strap has all of the letters that you need to remember to select the transform properties. Now, if I hit S, that will open up scale. If I hold down Shift while I hit R, it will also open up rotation. And these are the 2 properties we're going to animate here. It works exactly the same as position. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to select our initial animated layer, which was this one, and we're going to hit the U key on the keyboard. And that's a really useful shortcut. That's going to show me any keyframes that are attached to that layer. So that's going to show us keyframed properties for that layer. Now, when you can see keyframes, you can quickly jump between them by using these buttons here. That will go to the next keyframe, that will go to the previous keyframe. So if you click on this one to go to the next keyframe, we're ready to start animating our logo. Now, there are keyboard shortcuts for that. J and K will jump between keyframes. J will jump back, K will kick forward. And if you think jump keyframes, it's really easy to remember J and K. So what we're going to do is start animating scale and rotation. So we'll click on the stopwatches. And this again is a situation where actually this is where we want the animation to end, not to start. So do we then remove that and scale it down because we want to start with it smaller? No, we don't. Because we've set the keyframes, it's a waste of time removing them. Instead, we can drag a selection around the keyframes and just physically drag them a little bit later. So you can pick up and drag keyframes whenever you want. And now we're ready to set our initial rotation and scale. So what I'm going to do is just deselect the properties, and then let's change the scale value to 0. Okay, so it disappears. And we're also going to change the rotation value to -1. So in that first value, which indicates rotations, I'm going to put -1. And if we preview that now, using the RAM preview button, we'll see that comes in and then the logo scales up. Now the timing's not quite right yet, but all I want you to do is just think about the principle of animation, how we're managing to get things animating from one point to another. Now the other one that you can do is select the text, bring up the position property by hitting P. What we'll do is we'll have that coming in at maybe about 4 seconds, round about there. Again, click on the stopwatch to create your keyframe where you want it to end. Move back to where you want the animation to start. And we're going to drag it off to the right so that it comes on and is readable as it's coming on screen like this. Okay, so you should have a nice basic animation. Now there's a little bit more work to do on the timing to get that more dynamic and exciting, but that's the basics of keyframing in After Effects. And we're going to explore some more ways of controlling the timing and the motion paths for keyframing a little bit later.